Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. South Korea and China are mired in a diplomatic row over the Chinese envoy's abrasive comments. And the US, South Korea, and Japan are joining forces against North Korea's provocations and Chinese assertiveness. Today, we look at the geopolitical dynamics in Northeast Asia.
밀가에서 미국이 승리할 것이고 중국이 패배할 것이라는 그런 배팅이 하고 있는 것 같습니다. 하지만 이는 분명히 잘못된 판단입니다.
It certainly appears as if there was some sort of pressure tactic here used. South Korea is a sovereign, independent nation.
In the studio with me, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman served as Acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security until 2017. He returned to the State Department as Senior Advisor for International Security and Non-Proliferation until September of last year. Also joining us, Mr. Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a Washington-based policy initiative. Mr. Colby served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Mr. Colby, while trying to deepen U.S.-ROK alliance and military cooperation among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, South Korea still tried to manage its relations with China smoothly. However, the bilateral relations are deteriorating quickly, with two countries summoning the ambassadors. Now, what is your reaction that China is criticizing the Yoon government's foreign policy from various angles, including the U.S.-ROK alliance and U.S.-ROK-Japan cooperation?
Well, thank you, Eun-jung. I think we have to see it in the broader context of China's behavior and its overall perspective. I mean, candidly, I think you could look at their response to Secretary Blinken's upcoming visit and the readout. The Chinese MFA readout is quite different in tone. I would say it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they were lambasting the United States, that they were really being quite critical to us. So I think they are overall seeing what they regard as a Cold War kind of containment mindset, and they are going to go after anybody that they believe is in league with that, including South Korea, certainly Japan, of course Taiwan. I was at the Shangri-La dialogue. They were very critical of the government on Taiwan. To some extent, you've heard it about the government in the Philippines or in India and so forth. I also, more structurally, I think we've seen how China is likely to behave, is going to behave as it's more and more ascended, which is increasingly domineering. And I think South Korea is feeling that now, but that's not going to change. There might be tactical sort of evolution or a kind of a pullback by the Chinese at periods, but South Korea should expect this kind of behavior from Beijing over the long haul.
Mr. Countryman, Ambassador Shing's comments invited criticism from the South Korean president himself, and Ambassador Shing warned South Korea against making a wrong bet in U.S.-Sino rivalry, and he also urged Seoul to stop de-Chinaization. South Korea considers Ambassador Shing's comments as possible interference in internal affairs, while Chinese Foreign Ministry justified Ambassador Shing's comments, saying that the deterioration of relations is not China's fault. What is your reaction?
First, I don't think I would call it interference in internal affairs, but I would call it poor diplomacy. As Mr. Colby mentioned, China has an increasing tendency to be domineering, lecturing, condescending in its diplomatic relations with other countries. That used to be the exclusive province of Soviet and American diplomats, but more and more China is behaving this way as well. And I agree that you can expect to see more of that in the future.
Mr. Colby, a growing number of legislators from the ruling party in South Korea is calling for Ambassador Shing to be declared persona non grata and expelled. When a Chinese diplomat publicly and bluntly criticized Korea's efforts to strengthen its alliance with the United States and interfere with internal affairs, shouldn't South Korea respond more strongly to China than before? When China retaliated Korea for the deployment of THAAD, South Korea didn't do much.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand it, and obviously it's a South Korean decision, but I think that kind of attitude is the right one. Look, the reality with China is they are going to respect strength. Now, I stress that it's measured strength. We should not be pursuing, as some in the United States sometimes sound like, regime change or the humiliation or the dismemberment of China. That is not what we are after. But we need to present a firm and cohesive wall to China that compels them to respect our interests. I think what we've clearly seen with China, look, I mean, Tom mentioned some of the behavior of Chinese diplomats. In a sense, China is behaving more like a superpower, like an ascendant superpower than anything else.
In the aftermath of the THAAD deployment, do you think South Korea's attitude to appease China somehow brought on more Chinese assertiveness at the time?
Yeah, I mean, look, honestly, and I don't think this is something peculiar to the Chinese. If you have a rising great power and you appease it, what is the rational reaction of that great power? Well, I guess this works. And again, that's not to say that there aren't elements of accommodation or being prepared to compromise. But fundamentally, when you're dealing with your nation's security, I think we do have to be somewhat uncompromising in saying this is something where we're not going to give away our autonomy, our fundamental security. And I think the THAAD lesson is that you're not going to placate or appease them.
Mr. Countryman, do you think it was a personal off-the-cuff remark or a relayance of Chinese policy on South Korea? And President Biden used the term, it's never a good bet to be against the U.S. many times before, including U.S.-RK summit last year. By referencing President Biden's remarks, was the Chinese ambassador actually targeting the U.S., telling Washington that Beijing will not lose its influence over Seoul?
Well, several points there. First, it doesn't matter too much whether it was a personal view or a speech that had been approved entirely in Beijing beforehand. But there is certainly a trend in both the Russian and the Chinese foreign ministries that diplomats can advance their career by being louder, more provocative, by crossing the line, as you said, from assertive to abrasive. And that was fully on display in this case. And whether China learns anything from the reaction to its diplomacy is questionable. 10 years ago, Australia was prepared to be one of China's best partners in Asia Pacific. And that very heavy-handed response of China to relatively minor issues in Australia have completely flipped the public's perception of China among Australian citizens. They're at risk of doing the same thing again. In terms of retaliation or tit-for-tat measures, I would hope that Seoul could be the adult in the relationship and not respond to provocations by showing themselves to be provoked and to make counter-provocations.
Mr. Colby, South Korea's opposition party criticized President Yoon that the administration's lopsided diplomacy toward the U.S. at the expense of ties with China puts South Korea caught in the middle of U.S.-China rivalry. Is there a grain of salt in that comment? And the U.S. is important for Korea, but is balanced diplomacy that thinks about China and Russia a prudent approach for South Korea?
The grain of truth in the assessment is that South Korea is located in the middle of a U.S.-China rivalry, but also between Japan and of course close to Russia as well. What's fundamentally and profoundly mistaken about this, and this is something that really struck me when I was last in South Korea a few years ago, the most dangerous situation for a country that is geographically positioned like South Korea is, in the middle, in a sense, the most important geography you could imagine in this world, and of course, one of the world's largest economies, but actually the smallest one in the immediate area, is for it to be non-aligned, is for it to try to play both sides, because then it becomes, in the American expression, a no man's land. And then it potentially becomes metaphorically, and God forbid, in reality, a battlefield, because it's something that is fought over. There are many places in the world that are sort of irrelevant. Henry Kissinger famously said about Chile that it was a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica, with the idea being that it wasn't that important at the time. Similarly, New Zealand is far away from the center. These countries can pursue that kind of foreign policy, but unfortunately that is not a luxury that South Korea can have. The smart course, I believe, is the course that the government in Seoul is currently pursuing, which is to hew close to the United States.
Mr. Colby, how strongly will the United States stand by its allies to defend collective interest against any acts of Chinese intimidation? You talked about how South Korea should hew closer to the United States. President Biden and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the U.S. is de-risking and not decoupling from China. President Biden, as you just mentioned, that he said that he expected a thaw in Beijing-Washington relations shortly. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said it would be disastrous to cease trading with China. De-risk, yes. Decouple, absolutely not. If the U.S. softens its approach to China, and in that case, wouldn't South Korea's tough approach to China actually be harmful to South Korea?
Potentially, which is one of the many reasons why this thaw is such a bad idea, because it's fundamentally, the most important reason is that it's not in evidence. I mean, if you look at what the Chinese are actually saying, if you look at the foreign ministry statement, if there was an article in CNN that was reporting many experts within China, they don't believe there's a thaw. In fact, Xi Jinping had a National Security Commission meeting just a week or two ago in which he said for people to be prepared for extreme scenarios and rocky waters and so forth. So the thaw appears to be a projection. I see essentially no evidence for it. And China's basically saying, in order for there to be a thaw in anticipation of the visit by Secretary Blinken, the United States essentially has to capitulate on everything. So I'm actually confused what the administration is doing. There are smart people, very smart people in the administration. They presumably know this. I don't know whether they're trying to appeal to third parties as being reasonable, but I think the flaw in that logic is, as you say, and I've heard very similar things in places like India and Japan, well, we're sticking our necks out and taking a stand against China, and then you're trying to go back to this G2 thing. I mean, Secretary Yellen's comments were, really very worrying. I mean, that kind of attitude. I actually think she's analytically right in the sense that, as Sullivan himself said, we are at all-time highs of Sino-U.S. trade. But we should not be confused. We are in a fundamental geopolitical rivalry, and the right way to approach that is with firmness and strength and together.
Mr. Countryman, is Biden administration giving confusing signals to its allies?
I don't agree with the analysis that we've just heard. A thaw does not mean that suddenly we are going to embrace each other as best friends. It does not mean that we are going to establish a two-person directorate to run all the world's affairs. It means that we will seek to cooperate in areas where cooperation is necessary to solve problems, and that we will remain strong and committed to our allies who feel a threat from China. And with the exception of India just noted, I believe that the ROK and Japan want to see a reduction of tensions between the United States and China. It does not mean giving up on their security in any way.
Mm-hmm. It seems like the Biden administration has watered down its strong stance on China from decoupling to de-risking, because now everybody's talking about de-risking from the Biden administration. Isn't that giving confusing signals to its allies?
I never heard anyone in the Biden administration say decoupling.
Well, I just have a fundamentally different view. I associate myself with your questions. And I mean, the most important thing to know about the Biden administration's approach of cooperating while competing is the Chinese have not only have they shown no evidence of associating themselves, they are almost laughing at it. They're certainly criticizing it. And if you look at the statement by Qin Gang and the foreign ministry, they believe that the United States is the culprit and behind it. And whether that's right or not, we can't pretend that there's a thaw when there isn't a thaw. Obviously, we should seek to avoid unnecessary confrontation. But we can't wish that away. What I worry about, I think the questions that you have, I associate myself with them. I do think that there is significant risk. What worries me is that what we were actually seeing is that the Biden administration appears to be trying to turn down the temperature in Asia over China because their actual priority is Europe and Ukraine. And that does worry me. That's not what they're saying. But if you're a rational, self-interested actor in Asia, you have to say to yourself, these people are seeking to try to turn down the temperature and try to avoid provoking the Chinese. I mean, the President of the United States at the G7 called the balloon incident silly. I mean, that is an incredible statement. The Chinese flew a huge surveillance balloon over our whole country. It was an absorbing topic of international interest, and he referred to it as silly. What does that suggest about what else they're prepared to do? And more importantly, here's the key thing. We are not where we need to be in terms of our position of strength in Asia, and they appear to be in sort of setting up the possibility of preemptive concessions or giving away things or not doing things that are necessary in order to try to placate Beijing, which is hopeless and counterproductive.
I have to disagree on so many points. Nobody is talking about placating. Lowering the temperature is generally a good thing that a human adult does when it is possible. In the case of China, if the U.S. has to wait for the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman to say nice things about the U.S. before we are prepared to act in our own self-interest, we will wait forever. It is not a propaganda battle. It is a battle in which the United States traditionally, in the face of dictatorships in the Soviet Union, China, and elsewhere, takes the lead with strength, but also with realistic proposals for how to move forward. And nobody is talking about placating or surrendering to China.
I would just say I don't agree that it's an adult measure to essentially back down and placate. I disagree. I think it is placating clearly, and people can see it. I think an adult, that's why we have police. You don't allow this kind of bullying behavior, and I've seen it we've all seen it up close. So, I mean, the Chinese are doing unsafe maneuvers, and they're building up their military, and you can see it is a propaganda among all other things. So I think the right way to deal with this kind of person is to convince them, or a group of people, to convince them that they will not succeed in being aggressive.
I want to look at how serious China's threat is, especially militarily. Mr. Countryman, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or CPRI, said the size of China's nuclear arsenal had increased from 350 warheads in January 2022 to 410 in January 2023 and expected to keep growing. That China could potentially have at least same number of ICBM as US or Russia by the turn of the decade. Is China now out on a full-fledged nuclear armament expansion? And how much of a bigger threat is this to the region?
We don't know the ultimate Chinese purpose. We do know it is contrary to their stated interests for regional peace. We know it is contrary to the spirit of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as the only one of the 5 nuclear powers that is increasing its warhead. On the other hand, and I don't seek to placate anyone, I just point out facts. Right now, the Chinese have about 400 warheads which are not actively deployed, unlike the United States and Russia, which have warheads on missiles deployed with launch-on warning signals. China has traditionally had a no first use policy, that they would not use nuclear weapons first, which in my opinion is the right attitude for all nuclear powers to have. It concerns me very deeply that China is building the kind of force that makes that no first use pledge ever less credible. And that is, it's not so much that it significantly adds to its military power, it's that it adds to the sense of hyper-masculinity and strength that President Xi is trying to project. And that when put into practice, when put in a crisis, creates a higher risk of nuclear use.
Mr. Colby, as China is rapidly modernizing its nuclear force, do you think South Korea should also augment its military capabilities?
Absolutely. I think we all should. And most of all, the United States. Actually, South Korea is probably one of the most commendable of U.S. allies in terms of its military readiness. I have a much different assessment of the situation. We are undergoing what Admiral Aquilino and others have called an unprecedented peacetime military buildup. I mean, you'd have to go back to the height of the Cold War, in some ways even back to before the Second World War, to see something of equivalent size. You never really know about intentions, but when somebody's building up not only a nuclear force, but conventional military forces that are not only designed to take over Taiwan, but are designed to defeat the United States in a regional war in order to do so, and most importantly, clearly is designed for regional and ultimately global power projection. They are building aircraft carriers, space satellites, nuclear-powered submarines. They are looking at bases in the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, even the Atlantic Ocean. This tells you everything that you need to know. And by the way, their intentions are relatively clear. I mean, even Tony Blinken, of all people, is saying that Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready for an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Is it going to happen? Nobody knows. But if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it's a duck.
Mr. Countryman, the U.S. nuclear umbrella was designed to defend against North Korean nuclear threat. And we just talked about Chinese military augmentation and the modernization. Do you think the nuclear umbrella should include a Chinese nuclear threat, which is much bigger threat than North Korean nuclear threat?
Well, first, let me make a point in response to Mr. Colby. I agree that the United States, the ROK, and Japan have to work together more closely and build the military capabilities that would deter and, if necessary, engage China in any conflict in the region. We ought to focus on the right kind of weapons. When I see the United States committed to spending $2 trillion over the next 30 years on its nuclear weapons, and I realize how that is crowding out potential defense spending on more usable weapons that can be defensive, then I worry that we are not making smart choices in that trilateral defense. In terms of China's nuclear threats, what I see in Russia and Ukraine today is Russia using its nuclear arsenal. It has not detonated a weapon, but it has used its nuclear arsenal, as both the United States and the Soviets have in the past, to make threats and to seek to win a conventional war by raising fear of nuclear use, of actual nuclear detonations. It is something that worries me very much about China's buildup. And of course, it's a tactic that North Korea will certainly use, and I certainly don't discount the likelihood that in any conflict, China and the DPRK would collude. The deterrent against North Korea, as against China, is not first and foremost a nuclear deterrent. It relies upon conventional strength and cooperation first and foremost. I understand why President Yoon wants to call the Washington Declaration a nuclear alliance. He's got domestic political reasons for doing so. The focus on nuclear as the first thing you're going to use against attack from a nuclear-armed state is misplaced if it distracts you from doing the necessary work on your conventional deterrent.
Well, I'd just like to say something. Yunjun, I think my view is that the U.S. alliance commitment to South Korea and the alliance with South Korea means that South Korea is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, no matter who the attacker is. Now, I would word it a little differently. I think the spirit, I'm similar in that we are not looking to rely on nuclear weapons in the way that we did, say, under the Eisenhower administration. But nuclear weapons are always there. As somebody said, they're the big stick in the closet. And that is true of China. So just because we have not talked about our nuclear deterrent as being as relevant for vis-a-vis China for South Korea doesn't mean that it's not there. If China is going to have the capability to conduct military action directly against South Korea, even by the next decade, that means that our nuclear forces and our conventional forces will be critical. But the key is we'll need both of them, so I don't see them as trading off. The trade-offs we need to make are in other departments.
I would love to continue discussions, but that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Colby, Mr. Countryman, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.